Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the College of the Holy Cross. Together with my colleagues, Professors Daniel Klinghardt and Maria Rodriguez, and with Marissa George and Ben Tyag of the class of 21, who are student leaders of the College Republicans and the College Democrats, I'm pleased to be presenting today's discussion as part of the Holy Cross Elections Forum. Each week, the forum features guest speakers, faculty perspectives, student discussions on the many issues at stake in the November elections, from healthcare to climate change, the Supreme Court, racial justice, and today, foreign policy. Today's talk is being recorded, and you can find it along with our other events at bit.ly/Holy Cross Elections Forum. The campus community will also see a link to that in our email, our next weekly email. This week, we really couldn't do better than to hear from one of the nation's top foreign policy experts, Joseph Nye, who will help us to think about the many foreign policy issues at stake this election. Though much of the electorate has been turned inward in this election cycle, there are burning questions that we really do need to face about American foreign policy, from the worldview or grand strategy level to a whole range of policy particulars. Dr. Nye is University Distinguished Professor Emeritus and former Dean of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. From 1977 to 1979, he was Deputy Undersecretary of State, and he chaired the National Security Council Group on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. In 1993 and 94, he chaired the National Intelligence Council, which prepares intelligence estimates for the president. And in 1994 and 95, he served as Assistant Secretary for Defense for International Security Affairs. He won distinguished service medals from all of these agencies. In 2008, a poll of 2,700 international relations scholars listed him as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy. And in 2011, Foreign Policy listed him among the 100 leading global thinkers. Dr. Nye pioneered the international relations theory of neoliberalism, developed with Robert Cohen, the theory of complex interdependence, and coined the term soft power and advanced the term smart power that became popular in the Clinton and Obama administrations. Earlier this year, Dr. Nye published Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, in which he scores each of 14 presidents since 1945 on the ethics of their foreign policy and evaluates their leadership qualities and identifies which approaches work and which approaches do not. After his talk today, which is entitled, "What is a Moral Foreign Policy?" he'll answer questions posed by a panel of Holy Cross students. I'll also be taking questions in the chat box and would ask you to email those privately to me so that I can sort and share as many of those as possible. So please welcome Joe Nye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate that generous introduction. My mother might almost believe it. Let me address this question of what is a moral foreign policy by answering a question that a friend of mine asked, which is, why would you write a book about do morals matter? Isn't it obvious? And I suppose in everyday life we think it is, but in foreign policy and international affairs, there's something of a tradition of saying, well, they don't matter so much, and we can't really pay that much attention to them. The conventional wisdom in international relations is often that it's national interests that count, or national interests bake the cake, and then politicians come along and sprinkle a little moral icing on it to make it look pretty, but it's national interests that bake the cake. I once, when I was working the State Department, turned to a French diplomat at a dinner after we'd had a hard afternoon working on nuclear weapons questions. And I said, do you ever think about the moral implications of what we're doing? He says, there's no problem. He said, the only thing that matters is the interests of France. And I don't think he even realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made. But I think that is often typical in the way people approach foreign policy and the question, does morality belong in foreign policy? People say, well, what's wrong with having an attitude of America first? Isn't that what a president is supposed to do? And the answer, yes, a president is a trustee. He has to take care of the interests of the people who elected him or her. And in that sense, you would expect not just for President Trump to say America first, but you expect President Macron in France to say France first. But I think the problem with that is it oversimplifies the issue. The moral question is not whether the president has an obligation to take care of his constituents' interests. It's how does he define them? Does he define them narrowly of I win, you lose, or does he define them broadly that we can both win? Let me give you a simple little example of what I mean. Imagine that you were reading on the beach, nice summer day, and you had a good book, and let's suppose you were just about to finish a chapter, and you heard somebody crying out, help, help. There was a child just out at the surf, and you'd say, oh, I want to finish this chapter. No, of course not. You put down the book and try to save the child. Now, suppose the child had called out and said, ayúdame, or something in a foreign language. Would you say, oh, not an American, not English speaking, I don't have to help him? Of course not. You would put down the book and do something about it. And in that sense, there is a degree of cosmopolitanism, a degree of belief that we have responsibilities to other human beings that goes beyond just the national interest. But at the same time, there is a claim for the national interest. If you take the same example, if you heard two children crying, help, help, and you looked up and one of them was yours and one was a stranger, would you have a moral obligation to flip a coin? No, you would in fact first try to help your own child because there was an additional relationship, that of a parent, which increased the sense of moral duties that you had in that case. And that's a little bit like international relations. We do have a duty to all people as human beings, but it's also true that we have a duty to those who are in our own national community. And in that sense, I think this kind of debate that we've had in recent years about the world is divided between rootless cosmopolitans and true nationalistic Americans is a phony debate. It doesn't represent who we are. We have concentric circles of loyalties and identities, and we can be somebody who would jump into the surf to save a child at the same time that you can be a loyal American. And so this opposition that it's all the national interest or none at all misses who we really are. And that's what I was trying to get at in writing a book of Do Morals Matter? By looking back over the 14 presidents since 1945, I wanted to ask the question, if you have this cynical view that morals don't matter, that, or if you want that you check your morals at the water's edge, would you get history wrong? And I think I established in several of the chapters on the different presidents that if you have that cynical view, you're going to get history wrong. I think probably the most dramatic example of this is the case of Harry Truman, who is widely criticized by many for dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And many people say that this shows that he had no moral compass. But what they don't realize is that there was a third atomic bomb which could be dropped, which was on the island of Tinian. And after seeing the results of dropping the first bombs, which had already been programmed, Truman told the military not to drop the third bomb. He said, I'm not going to kill that many more children. So in that sense, he was rather a quick learner. But more importantly, 5 years later, when during the Korean War, when the United States was losing, it was stalemated, China had intervened and pushed us back across the 38th parallel. There was a question about whether we were going to be pushed off the peninsula. And General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, who was the military leader at the time in the Far East, told Truman that if Truman gave him permission to drop 25 to 40 bombs on Chinese cities, he could win the war for him. And Truman said no. And Truman's advisors and others warned him that this could destroy his presidency if he didn't win the war. But Truman still stuck with his guns and said no. And in that sense, it was a profoundly moral decision. As Tom Schelling, the Nobel economist, once put it in his Nobel laureate lecture, said probably one of the most important norms and taboos that's been established since 1945 was the nuclear taboo, that nuclear weapons are to be used solely for deterrence and not for warfighting. Imagine Truman had decided that differently. Imagine that his moral views had not entered into the equation and he just thought about his reelection. What a different world we would live in today if nuclear weapons were normal warfighting weapons. So in that sense, it's an existence theorem, if you want, an example of a president whose moral views had a profound impact on both our country, but also on the world. So in the 14 case studies that you mentioned, I tried to illustrate that it's not just true, but there are many other examples where morals played a role. But if you establish the point that you can make distinctions, that there can be a moral foreign policy, that moral views do matter, then the question arises of, right, how should we judge morality in foreign policy? Is it just like any other moral issue or not? And very often there's a tendency to do shortcuts as we make moral judgments about foreign policy. One shortcut is sometimes identified with what's called American exceptionalism, that we see ourselves as an exceptionally moral people. Therefore, if we do it with good intentions, it must be good. That's really not adequate. Another shortcut is that, well, if it turned out all right, then it's good. In other words, if the consequences were good, then the action was good. That's also not adequate. Both of these are shortcuts to real moral reasoning. I think what we need to do as we think about this is to have what I call three-dimensional moral reasoning, in which we look at the motives and intentions, the means that are used, and the consequences, and we try to balance all three. This is actually something which I derive from an old Catholic teaching that goes back to St. Augustine, just war theory, which is, if you look at just war theory, where Augustine had to say, if the good don't defend themselves, will evil prevail? And the answer is, well, you must defend yourself, but with limits, with moral limits. And it meant you had to have not only just cause and good intention, but also moral means and a high probability of success or good consequences. So my three-dimensional morality really has roots that go way beyond anything that I've thought of. But let me illustrate it by the case of the Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq. Ari Fleischer, who was the press secretary for George W. Bush, said that you had to admire Bush's morality, that Bush had extraordinary moral clarity. He was trying to bring democracy and freedom to the Middle East. And that for Fleischer meant that the action was moral. But that's an example of what I meant of a shortcut that isn't really good moral reasoning. And to illustrate that, let me give you a sort of a homely example. Imagine that your daughter she's going to take the SAT exams on Saturday morning, and a friend of yours says, oh, I'll go pick her up at the dance. I will make sure she gets back early and gets a good night's sleep before the exams. And so your friend picks her up, but it doesn't notice that it's been raining, that the road has gotten very slick on this country road, and tries to drive at 70 or 75 miles an hour, skids off the road, and hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. His intentions remain good, but you wouldn't say that that was a moral action. You would say inappropriate means and inappropriate failure to pay due diligence to the prospect of horrible consequences, even if they're unintended. So I would argue that the invasion of Iraq was something like that. Maybe Bush had good intentions to go into Iraq for getting more of what he called his freedom agenda in the Middle East. But if you take that a step further and you ask about the means, he did not have the means to accomplish that. And there were many papers prepared by the intelligence community and by the State Department which warned him that he didn't have the means to do it. And they were basically cast aside. Little attention was paid to them. And the net effect of that was unintended consequences of the strengthening Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually morphed into the Islamic State with horrendous consequences for not just Iraq, but the region as a whole. In that sense, you could say that it's true, Bush didn't intend these consequences, but if this were a legal case, we would say that he failed to do due diligence and that there was indeed culpable negligence. So I would argue that you can apply this three-dimensional morality to issues like a foreign policy decision, such as the invasion of Iraq. Well, if we establish first that morals matter, and second, that there is a way to judge them, then we have to ask, all right, what comes below these broad headings of intentions, means, and consequences? And I try to develop a little scorecard which allows us to look at the presidents in these terms. So on intentions and the goals and motives, we have to ask at least two questions. One is, what is the moral vision? Did the president express attractive values, and did those values determine his motives? And did he have the emotional intelligence to avoid contradicting those values because of his personal needs? The second question we have to ask under intentions is issues about prudence. Did the president have the contextual intelligence to wisely balance the values that he was pursuing and the risks that he was imposing on others? Did he do due diligence, and was he guilty of culpable negligence? If we turn to the second dimension of means, there we have to ask two questions. One is, what about the use of force? And here we can turn to just war theory and ask, did the president use it with attention to necessity, discrimination in treatment of civilians, and proportionality of benefits and damages? But we also want to ask a second question, not just about force, but about liberal concerns which relate to institutions and values. Did the leader try to respect and use institutions at home and abroad? And to what extent were the rights of others considered? When we turn to the third dimension of consequences, there are three questions that I propose. First one is about the fiduciary or responsibilities. Was the president a good trustee for the interests of the American people? Were the long-term interests of the United States advanced? The second question under consequences is cosmopolitan. Did the president also consider the interests of other peoples and minimize unnecessary damage to them? And the third question I think one has to ask under consequences, are what I call educational questions. Did the president respect the truth and build credibility? Were facts respected? Did the president try to create and broaden moral discourse at home and abroad? So the three dimensions obviously can be expanded to those 7 questions. Having done that, then I tried to look at the different presidents and give them a scorecard. And what I note is that it's rare that a president comes out with a perfect score on all of these dimensions. That would be asking too much. So we're winding up having to weigh and balance different aspects of these 7 questions. But I think a lot of this depends then on the context or the situation that a leader finds himself or herself in. For example, some aspects of international relations have very limited room for moral decisions. If you, as some realists say, if you believe that there is no higher government in international relations, it's kill or be killed, it's all self-defense, there's no larger international court to impose restrictions on states, it becomes a matter of survival, and the president is responsible, or the leader is responsible for the survival of the people who elected him. And a case that's sometimes cited on this was the case of Winston Churchill in 1940. Remember, after Hitler broke through the Ardennes and swept across the north of France and drove Britain into the sea at Dunkirk and took over the French government, there was still a question of what was going to happen to the French Navy. And Churchill feared that if the Vichy government gave away the French Navy, gave it to the Germans as a right of conquest, Britain would not be able to defend itself. It couldn't protect its shores. And so Churchill did something which under normal circumstances would be totally immoral. He bombed his ally. Churchill the British bombed the French fleet and killed 1,300 French sailors. And he justified this as saying it was essential for the survival of my people. The alternative, which was that Nazism would prevail and take over all of Western Europe, was the greater evil. So you can think of extreme circumstances like that, where the room for moral decisions is narrowed down to virtually nothing. The trouble is very often the realists who cite these views that international relations is an anarchic world with no other government, treat the world as though it's Churchill facing Hitler in 1940, and it's not. Most decisions in foreign policy are not those dire circumstances of survival, but give much more room for moral choices. As I said earlier, it's not whether you defend the national interest, it's how you define it. For example, when the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul a few years ago, President Trump's reaction was, well, it's a tough world out there. We need the Saudis as allies. We need to sell arms to the Middle East. We need the oil. So we're not going to say much about it. But even the conservative Wall Street Journal said that this was a travesty, that we should have at least done something to have reasserted basic American values. After all, Khashoggi was domiciled in the US, and that sort of behavior is profoundly abhorrent to our values. So the Wall Street Journal complained that Trump, even though they had a conservative viewpoint in our editorial page, had not defended American values. That it wasn't a case like the French fleet in 1940, but Trump was treating it that way. You don't have to break relations with Saudi Arabia. You certainly weren't going to send in the 82nd Airborne, But you could say that we could make a statement condemning the actions. We could have withdrawn the ambassador. We could have cut back on some arms sales and so forth. And so many foreign policy decisions are of that sort, which is a trade-off. People sometimes say, well, what is the role of human rights? Human rights is not the only dimension of foreign policy. Foreign policy is something where we try to get as many values as we want, realizing there often have to be trade-offs among them. So, for example, in a case like this, we did have an interest in stability in the Middle East, in keeping a relationship with Saudi Arabia, but it didn't mean that we couldn't express our values, or at least have some sort of a cutback on arms sales to have expressed our repulsion at what had happened to Khashoggi. So in that sense, I think the great problem I see with many of the people who take the cynical realist view that it's a dog-eat-dog world of survival, it's all or nothing, is I don't complain that you shouldn't start with realism. You should. It is a different world in the international domain than domestic, well-regulated society. My complaint is too many realists stop where they start. In other words, having said that this is the nature of international politics, they then don't think, but is there enough room for me to add those cosmopolitan values of thinking about the relations of other people and the rights and duties we have toward other people? Is there enough room for us to think about the role of institutions and whether we can respect institutions? It may be that you're in a Churchillian situation where you can't, but I suspect that you're going to find on most foreign policy decisions that you can. And that's why the hard questions come into how you make these trade-offs. One of the questions is about this liberal values is the role of institutions. And there, if a president neglects institutions, the danger is that you're changing the game of international relations in a direction that it doesn't have to be. You're treating it as though institutions don't matter. Robert Axelrod, a political scientist at the University of Michigan, did a very interesting computer tournament some years ago in which he tested various people with the game of prisoner's dilemma, where a prisoner will get off more lightly if he squeals against his fellow accomplice in crime. The general tendency in the game is to cheat, to defect. What Axelrod showed is that if you play the game once, that's the way it turns out. But if you play the game over and over again, you realize that your best strategy for the long run is reciprocity, what Axelrod called tit for tat. You cheat on me, I'll cheat on you. In the next game, you cheat on me, I'll cheat on you. In the third game, if you cooperate, then I'll cooperate with you. Or maybe we'll find a way to advance this institutional framework of reciprocity. Axelrod called this creating the long shadow of the future, which if I know we're going to play this game over again, I can escape this situation of treating the world as though it's Britain and Germany in 1940. And that's what institutions do in international relations. They're imperfect, they don't solve all problems, but they do create a long shadow of the future. And in that sense, one of the reasons I put in on those criteria under means, whether a president paid attention to the institutional concerns and the rights of others, was that it is something which can change the way in which we play the game of international relations, and therefore whether we can afford a moral foreign policy. Now, it won't always work in all circumstances. There are extreme situations, but it does make a difference if we pay attention to that. And that goes also to why I've stressed this point about education. A president can make a point of educating the people about the important role of institutions and values such as human rights. Well, when I summarized all that in looking at the presidents, I divided them into four categories, well, three major categories, I guess, which had four presidents in each category. The people who turned out best, nobody, as I said, had a perfect score, but the people who turned out best were Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush. And the presidents who turned out to have the lowest moral scores were Lyndon Johnson in foreign policy. Of domestic affairs, he did much better. In foreign policy because of the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon in large part because of the Vietnam War, George W. Bush because of the invasion of Iraq that I mentioned earlier, and tentatively I've put the current president, Donald Trump, in that bottom category, though the technical footnote, if you want, that his record is incomplete. So if we were grading him for a course, we'd have to have an asterisk saying incomplete, but see the teacher needs further improvement. So in that sense, the rest of the presidents I stretched out in between. As I said, none of them got a perfect score. It's impossible in international relations to get a perfect score, but it does make a difference whether you try to achieve these seven goals that I put down under the three dimensions of motives, means, and consequences. And as Henry Kissinger once said, so many of the decisions in international relations and foreign policy are in that area of 51-49. They're hard calls. I agree with that, but it doesn't excuse us from trying to make those hard calls. And as I say in the book, I'm less interested in whether people agree with my particular ranking of the presidents. I may want to change my own ranking as I discover more information or think harder about it. But I do want to stress very much that we shouldn't take these shortcuts to adequate moral reasoning, but should do good moral reasoning in all three dimensions as we try to sort our way through this extraordinary complex domain of foreign affairs and ask ourselves, what is a moral foreign policy? So that's basically what I wanted to say. There's more to be said, but it can be found in the book. I'd much rather have questions and answers with the students.
Well, thank you very much. That was a great overview of the book, and I'm really grateful for the multidimensional framework that you have to offer. There's a lot that any policymaker has to keep account of there, but I think there are lots of ways you touch on different ways that ethics have been done and take into account a lot of those perspectives. So I'm grateful for that. Maybe I'll turn to some of the student questions and maybe start with maybe an intervention question. So Caitlin Roman, Katie had a question that she wanted to ask you that related, I know, to intervention.
Yes, so thanks for speaking with us. My question was, do you think that the United States has an obligation as one of the world's leading powers to intervene in other countries' affairs and lend them assistance only when requested? And if so, where do we draw the line between being generous and like what's in our best interest, and how do we prevent getting taken advantage of?
Well, that's a great question, Katie, because it's been one of the central questions in our foreign policy debates. The big divisions in our country have been, biggest divisions have been over the Vietnam War and the Iraq War. And I think the way to try to answer your question, and I try to get at this a little bit in the book, is to think of what intervention means. Intervention means being involved in or interfering in the affairs of another country. And you can do that in a variety of ways. We pay a lot of attention to the most dramatic ways, like the wars, where you send in troops. In Vietnam, we had 560,000 American troops there. That's a very major intervention. You can also intervene in another country to take the other end of the spectrum just by what you say. For example, in my example, my case that I gave of Khashoggi's murder, it could have been just a statement by the president saying we condemn this behavior, which is like a tap on the wrist. So somewhere in between a tap on the wrist or a slap on the wrist and and sending in the troops, there are many things in between that we could do. We can do such things as have general sanctions against the country. We can do such things as have targeted sanctions, not against all the people, but against particular identified elites who are responsible for human rights violations. We can do things such as intervening in a more positive sense of sending in assistance for democracy building, such as the International Republican Institute or the National Democratic Institute. So there are a variety of ways that we can intervene, whether at one end of the spectrum or another. My own feeling is that it should be extremely rare that we use the high end of the spectrum, the military end, because there are almost always such large unintended consequences, which are likely to turn out the wrong way. Doesn't mean always. For example, we sent troops to Liberia when the dictator Charles Taylor was running rampant and assassinating people. We were able to use a very small number of troops to overthrow him. Similarly, the British sent in troops to Sierra Leone next door. But these were very small interventions using force against relatively weak, not popularly supported opponents. So I wouldn't rule out all humanitarian interventions that involve force, but I would say that in most cases, you're better off if you keep your interventions at the lower end of the scale that I described for you.
Thank you. Ben Tayeg has a question about non-state actors.
Hi, thanks for talking with us today. Authors like Jessica Matthews have argued that nation states are being outcompeted by NGOs, nonprofits, other non-state actors. I'm just curious, how has the Trump administration affected this competition, and how would maybe a Biden administration change this? And tie it back to the book, what also kind of moral choices are these non-state actors faced with? Thank you.
Well, I think Jessica's right that non-state actors have become more important over time. Technology has made international politics much more complicated than when we could look just at nation states. It's not totally new. I mean, there were multinational corporations as far back as the East India Company and so forth, but they are certainly today much more powerful than they were because of technological changes. And companies can have global supply chains and can allocate resources across vast areas of the globe. And if you look at the social media companies, I mean, something like a company like Facebook has more people that participate in Facebook than there are citizens of China. So this is quite an extraordinary change in scale. With that said, notice that these companies often have interests of their own and can sometimes be turned against us. So in 2016, we saw that Russia was able to use Facebook to intervene in the American elections in favor of President Trump. And many people thought, well, because Facebook's a big multinational with its headquarters in California, in Silicon Valley, that means it's a tool of the American government. Well, the Russians were able to turn it around into a tool of their intelligence community. So in that sense, the complexity of the world, that there's a power transition, not just among states, but from governments to non-state actors, this is a long-term trend, and this is going to be true whether you have a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency. One could hope for a more cautious and careful treatment of the way something like the Russian interference was basically poo-pooed by the Trump administration under a Biden administration. But the prospects that that others could use these companies for their purposes will remain whether you have Biden or Trump.
Thanks. Let me take a question from our Q&A function. One of our attendees wants to know, does Trump's most recent Middle Eastern Abrahamic deal change Trump's place on your list?
If Trump were actually to bring about peace in the Middle East in a serious way, he would certainly, I think, jump out of the cellar and up into one of those lower floors in the hierarchy I described. But I think it's just too soon to know whether what we've seen so far is a step in the right direction, but it's done nothing for the basic it's done nothing for the basic Palestinian-Israeli peace process. There are some people who say it may even have set back the two-state solution, for example. But in any case, it hasn't solved all the Arab-Israel problems in terms of conflict, and it may or may not have done any good for the Israeli-Palestinian. If it turns out, and we're much too close to it in terms of time now to know the answer, if it turns out that it is a turning point in a peace process which is real and durable in the Middle East, yes, I'd have to give him a better ranking.
So perhaps while we're in that corner of the world, Aidan Braun, the class of 21, has a question related to Iran.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us today. I guess one of the most drastic moves on the part of the Trump administration was to pull out of the JCPOA and re-implement sanctions on Iran. Obviously, Iran has responded by hastening enrichment activities and increasing their uranium stockpile. So just two questions there. If Biden wins the election, what steps should his administration take to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities? And additionally, does the U.S. have a moral obligation to, one, limit Iran's nuclear capabilities, and two, lift sanctions which have caused massive economic disruption in Iran?
I think that it was a big mistake to pull out of the JCPOA. It was interesting in the sense that you had a consensus among all the great powers in the Security Council, the permanent veto powers, to join in sanctioning Iran if it didn't agree to setting these limits. And the fact that you get Russia and China on board with that was a major accomplishment. I think it was a big mistake to drop that. I think I don't know what Biden will do if he is elected, but I think there'll be a major effort to, if not rejoin JCPOA, it may be too late to just sort of pick it up as it was, to negotiate another version of it and to find another way to limit, to get Iran to limit its nuclear weapons capability. And I think in that sense, I think it was a mistake for the Trump administration to have pulled out and without having a better alternative. That somehow they believed that that Iran was going to collapse if we pulled out, that our sanctions were going to do that, have that effect, but it clearly hasn't had that effect. So I think the use of sanctions under the Obama administration to try to bring Iran to the bargaining table turned out to be plausible and workable. The use of sanctions to create regime change or to get Iran to totally change its positions, I think, was unrealistic. And I'm hoping that Biden will go back, if he's elected, to the first type of approach rather than what we've seen in the last couple of years.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, Axon has a question about whether everything's different in our futures.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much again for being here with us. My question is that while the public health crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic will eventually end at some point, it has obviously in some ways changed the ways that people work and go to school, and it has certainly impacted American economics and public policy. How do you foresee the COVID-19 pandemic changing US foreign policy in coming years, particularly with regards to things like globalization and supply chains, and also the US-China relationship?
Well, it's a very important question, and to be honest, nobody knows the answer. So the answer I'm going to give you is my best guess. But here's my guess. I would like to have thought that the pandemic was a wake-up call. People used to say during the Cold War that the only way the Russians and the Americans would, Soviets and the Americans would ever get together was if there was a threat of an invasion from Mars. Well, we had the equivalent of the invasion from Mars in the sense that a virus may be from this planet, but it doesn't care which humans it kills or what their nationality is. And you would have thought that when we suffered that, we might have said, oh my gosh, there's some bigger things going on here. Maybe we better learn to cooperate. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Part of the fault was China's. Xi Jinping's first reaction to the pandemic was denial and censorship, and then blame shifting. And Trump's reaction to the pandemic was the same. It was first denial and then blame shifting, calling it the Chinese virus and so forth. And the idea then that we would pull out of the World Health Organization and blame it for being too close to China when we have not given it the support that it needs, it doesn't make much sense. So in that way, we missed an opportunity, we meaning humans, both Chinese and Americans, to do something new and different. Imagine that if we had taken the lesson of the Marshall Plan, which I describe in my book, where Harry Truman decided to define the American national interest broadly. We gave away to Europe at the end of World War II about 2% of our gross national product, gross domestic product. We did that because it was in our interest. We didn't want communism to take over Europe, but it was also in their interest. So by defining the national interest broadly, Truman was able, with the Marshall Plan, to basically get at the creation of a free and democratic Western Europe, which has been closely allied with us both militarily, but it's in terms of values as well. I imagine that when the COVID situation came up, we had said we're going to take the lead of getting the other countries in the group of 20 most important economies to donate to a multi-billion-dollar COVID assistance plan for poor countries that don't have adequate public health systems. And imagine we said, yes, we're going to have a warp speed program for developing our own vaccines, but we're also going to make sure that we're going to reserve 20% of those vaccines for helping first responders or health professionals in poor countries. And we'll commit ourselves to that. What a difference that would have made in terms of how people would have seen international politics and the prospects of international politics. Not only would it have greatly increased America's soft power, but it might have been something like what I described as Axelrod's creating a long shadow of the future, that we can cooperate on things, that we can define our national interests broadly. And again, you could say, would we really want to sacrifice American interests so much? It's not that much of a sacrifice in the following sense. If we feel that we're safe in the Northern Hemisphere, when we think we have COVID under control. And the coronavirus has vast reservoirs in the southern half of the globe, and it surges back in seasonal ways, we're not safe. So it's in our interest, as well as a humanitarian gesture, to try to do something like a Marshall Plan for COVID. But it's an opportunity we've missed. I would love to believe that if Biden becomes president, that he would still seize this opportunity. It would make a huge difference, but I have no idea whether he'll do it or be able to do it. But it's clear that the first round that both the Chinese and American leaders had in dealing with this equivalent of the invader from Mars was a failure in leadership. And blaming China is not the way to reassert leadership. Similarly, if you withdraw from the World Health Organization, which may be imperfect in some ways, but is the best thing we have going, that just leaves the field free for the Chinese. And failing to join the new COVAX facility for COVID virus, which the United States has refused to join, where something like 170 other countries have joined it, is again a failure of leadership. So I would like to believe that we can learn from this COVID lesson along the lines you were describing, but so far we don't seem to have done very well at it.
Thank you. Since you mentioned China, I'll turn to a question from Dan Dempsey, class of 21.
Hi, thank you for being here. The Human Rights Council has often been a target of criticism, as many of its members have a poor human rights record domestically, yet purport to uphold human rights internationally. In your opinion, will the cosmopolitan interests of human rights protection suffer as a result of the United States' departure from the Human Rights Council? Or is the United States better able to protect human rights separate from the Council?
Well, I think both. I think if we want to advance human rights, just leaving the Council leaves it open for the authoritarians to have free reign. You've got to realize the Human Rights Council has many imperfections, as you describe them, and we should be trying to develop a coalition of like-minded countries to try to improve or reform that. And we should certainly have a major set of programs outside of what we do at the UN Human Rights Council to try to advance human rights. But leaving the field open for the authoritarians is not the right way to do it. So even if most of our activity is outside the Human Rights Council, leaving that field open for the authoritarians to manipulate any way they want doesn't strike me as a sensible way to do things.
Thanks. Let me turn to Peter Mitchell of the class of 21. Peter?
So I have a question regarding President Trump's transaction by transaction approach to foreign policy. And you spoke some about Axelrod's long shadow of the future. And how does President Trump's transaction by transaction approach kind of compare to prior presidents' use of a more cooperative approach to foreign policy?
Well, Trump is not the only president to think about transactions. Obviously, a president has to think about transactions in terms of getting the best deal he can for the United States. The question is, how does he define the deal? How narrowly does he do it? For example, in devaluing institutions, there's something to be said for Trump's approach, which is if you're a giant, which the US is, it's still the world's largest economy. If we can go up against other countries one-on-one, we're likely to win more. We're going to probably, in trade disputes and so forth, we'll probably have somewhat better earnings, if you want, by using our power in bilateral frameworks rather than multilateral frameworks. On the other hand, if you destroy the multilateral frameworks, the institutional frameworks, then you're essentially undercutting that long shadow of the future and that prospect for a world in which everybody is better off. In other words, we'll win some transactions, we'll lose some, but the world as a whole, including us, will be better off. Now, people would reply to that by saying, well, the World Trade Organization has been imperfect and the Chinese have not played properly by the rules. And there's a lot to be said for that. At some point, we probably are going to have to turn to new types of reforms of trade institutions. But just retreating to bilateralism, even though it might help us in the short run, is probably not going to be the best way we could define our national interest in the long run.
Thanks. Let me turn to Evan Crum, who has a question about collective ethics of notions of morality.
Hi, thank you for your time today and speaking to us. I have a question about how the morals of the public should be factored in, not only, I guess, to a president's decision making, but how we understand and how we can judge his foreign policy decisions after the fact. I'm specifically thinking of Rwanda in 1994 as an example of public opinion coloring perhaps how we understand President Clinton's response.
Well, a president elected in a democracy has to pay attention to the views of his constituents. He has a moral obligation to reflect them, but he doesn't have to, if he thinks there is a broader or longer term dimension to their interests, he can try to educate them on that. For example, in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt thought that Hitler was a real threat. The American public as a whole thought that getting involved in Europe was a mistake and it was immoral. Roosevelt was not able to actually change American opinion on that. He was saved by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But what he had done was prepare the American people so that if we were in a situation where he could get public support, we could do something about it. So he had instituted a draft, he had created war production industries, he had begun to restore some of the military capabilities we had. And so that's an example where a president who can't he tries to educate public opinion, he can't turn it around, but he can keep working at it and preparing so that if the circumstances change, he can use them. On the question of Rwanda in particular, President Clinton himself has said afterwards that he had made a mistake on this. The American public, particularly after the debacle in Somalia, was not prepared to support sending American troops. But there are other things you could do besides sending in American troops. We could have, for example, supported the United Nations peacekeeping troops that were already on the ground. We could also have tried to recruit from African countries and neighbors like Kenya and others, troops, and then we could have offered them logistics and intelligence support to get them there under blue helmets for peacekeeping purposes. We could not have saved all the Tutsis who were slaughtered in the genocide, but we could have saved some. And if we could have saved some, then we should have saved some. And I think looking backwards, that Clinton realizes that was something where he could have done more.
Sorry, I'm aware we're at 5 o'clock. I know there's some good student questions and questions in the chat box. Do we need to end now, or do you want to take?
I can go on for about 5 or 6 more minutes. Let's see.
So let's see if we can do some of those. One question that I had from Mitchell Baker, who's a student. When you analyze past presidential elections in terms of foreign affairs, do you examine presidential cross-cultural competency of their adversaries at the time? A head of state that leaves their ethnocentric view and understands where the adversary is coming from may very well be able to do more to engage in moral actions due to an absence of misunderstanding. So
I think that's an important point, and it's one of the reasons why I rank the first President Bush so high. When the Berlin Wall went down, Bush was criticized for not making a bigger fuss about it in terms of public opinion. And Bush's comment was, I have to negotiate with Gorbachev. I'm not going to dance on the wall. That's a good example of what the question is about.
Another wants to know, here's a more direct, has Trump had any moral foreign policies? Would you say he's even had a foreign policy, or is his a domestic policy that's controlling national policies?
Well, if you look at Trump's use of force, it's been relatively restrained. And so in my scorecard for him, I give him credit for that. On the other hand, and if he succeeds on this effort in the Middle East, I will give him credit for that, though it's not clear how much of that or how that's going to turn out, as I mentioned earlier. But if you read the book by John Bolton, of Trump's former national security advisor, Bolton, who was there, as he puts it, in the room where it happened, says that Trump was guided primarily by his own personal interests and re-election and political interests, not by a sense of larger national strategy. Bolton was there. I wasn't, but we'll have to see on how this Middle East issue turns out. Sometimes people will get the right answers for the wrong reasons.
Quick question. Omar Afifi asks, what should the future U.S. President do about the Uyghur Muslims in China?
I think we should be making clear that we disapprove of the way China is repressing the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And that would include, as we're doing, imposing sanctions on some of the Chinese Communist Party officials who have been directly responsible for some of the worst excesses. So that I'll give Trump credit for, and I hope that would continue if there's a change of administration.
Let me take one more question, then we can wrap up. It's from Sam Carroll, Samantha, and she has a question about, I suppose you could call it misunderstandings of a moral approach. And it's a good way to sort of summarize where you've gone with the book and give you a chance to make that a last response. Sam?
Hi, sorry, I know you have to go, so I'll be quick. But my final question is that some critics of the moral approach believe that personal morals or values have no role in the presidency because they are too closely tied to emotions. You reference in your book the importance of reconciling political duties with a level of morality. How might you articulate a distinction between this morality versus emotions for these critics?
Well, it's a very interesting and important question. A president will understand your emotions and master them so they don't distort your responsibilities. And that is, so for example, if you take the case of Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy, both of them got involved in Vietnam, but Kennedy, by the accounts of McGeorge Bundy, who was the national security advisor for both Kennedy and Johnson, wanted to be seen as smart and probably would not, in Bundy's view, have escalated in Vietnam. Johnson, in Bundy's view, was afraid of being seen as a coward. His emotional concern was being the man who lost Vietnam and how this would affect his self-image. And that led him to escalate even when he began to realize that he wasn't going to win the war. So there's a case where emotional differences in emotional intelligence made a difference to a major foreign policy decision. But to generalize your question, I think the critical thing that we should ask ourselves as we judge a moral foreign policy is, was the president acting because of personal motives? Have the personal motives basically corrupted his larger intentions or objectives? Most presidents will state noble objectives, but those noble objectives may be twisted by these emotional means. And you have to look at it case by case. I mean, the great condemnation by Bolton in his book against Trump was that Trump let his personal ego and personal political interests interfere. So even when he had good intentions or seemed to get in the right direction, according to Bolton, this was really being twisted by personal emotional needs. So different precedents will turn out differently, but I do think it's one of the things we have to consider as we try to make these judgments about what's a moral foreign policy.
So thank you so much. That was thoughtful enough that it led me to break my 1 hour rule a little bit, and I'm grateful for you to for sticking with that. I'm grateful for the student questions and for bringing foreign policy back to the into our framework as we think about this coming election. So it's wonderful to meet you, and I'm grateful for all the work you've done.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you to all the students for what was a very good set of questions.
Thank you.